Hello, welcome in Geneva, welcome to the United Nations. Our guest today is the Secretary-General of the United Nations, Mr. António Guterres. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
You're in Geneva for the donor conference on Yemen. This is the fourth year of war. It's the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. The figures are terrible. Over 22 million Yemenis need care, assistance. We have to solve the humanitarian crisis. That's why you're here. What are the material results that you can suggest to Yemenites today?
Well, it must be said that this conference has been a success. We obtained double the amount that we obtained a year ago, $2 billion. We had asked for $3 billion. And we will have even more donations by the end of the year. This will enable us to increase substantially our capacity to respond to the needs, or the most urgent needs of the populations of Yemen. This humanitarian aid is absolutely essential, but this aid must be really distributed everywhere. The question of access is essential to enter Yemen and then to distribute the donations across the whole of the country. There is no strictly humanitarian solution to a humanitarian crisis. The solution is always political. I have recently appointed a new special envoy, Martin Griffiths, who has started visiting the region, and I hope we will be able to draw up a plan that will enable us to put an end to this war.
I'd like to get back to the donations. We talked about 930 million given by Saudi Arabia and United Emirates. Well, they are the ones who are leading the coalition, who's causing most of the civilian death, and it raises a, I should say, ethical situation, ethical question. On the one hand, they're giving to Yemen. On the other hand, they're bombing them. Recently, a family was killed by bombs 2 days ago. We wonder if it's not really hypocrisy.
It must be said that it's a war involving a lot of stakeholders, but independently of this fact, there are humanitarian needs which are essential. And I think that the fact that Saudi Arabia and the Emirates have assumed making a decisive contribution to humanitarian operations is in itself a positive aspect. Another issue is that of the war itself and the political solution to the war.
So when they signed this huge check, did you tell them, it's good, but you should stop bombing civilians and commit crimes?
We have said three things which are very clear. We have said so publicly, we have repeated them. All opportunities have been used for this. First of all, we need humanitarian aid. We need resources for this. And then we need unrestricted access.
There are still limitations.
There are still restrictions to access. But we must recognize that we made a lot of progress, and the restrictions also come from the Houthi side. There are many difficulties to penetrate the regions controlled by the Houthis. But access. Thirdly, everybody must respect international law, humanitarian international law.
Which is not the case.
Which is not the case
by no one
in Yemen today. But this law, international humanitarian law, must be respected, and protection of civilians must be respected. And thirdly, we need a political solution.
So when you met with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in New York,
we discussed all these aspects.
Did he commit on the access, which is not unlimited today, the accesses to the ports, to the airports, and to the political process? Did he say, I am ready to discuss with the Houthis, or even with Iran, that he accuses to manipulate the Houthis?
In terms of access, great progress has been made.
Not enough.
Not enough yet, but major progress has been made. It must be recognized. And there has been a clear commitment to open the ports and to open the airport in Sana'a.
When?
The Saudis have said, from their point of view, there's no problem. There have been some difficulties with the Yemen government, which we hope to solve, but also a commitment. Our special envoy was in Riyadh, and he has received guarantees that Saudi Arabia wants to initiate a process of dialogue and peace with all the other parties involved, the key parties involved, to restore peace.
Key elements include Iran. Did you appeal to the Iranians?
First of all, it's an intra-Yemen dialogue.
But it didn't work.
The different parties of Yemen, and then with all the countries which are active in the region. And naturally, it must be recognized that Iran has a role to play, and Iran must also cooperate to establish peace.
Did you ask the Iranians?
Yes, I've just had a meeting with the ambassador of Iran to the United Nations, and he told me that Iran would be prepared not to put pressure, but to encourage the Houthis to engage in a dialogue for a political solution.
So you have a faint hope?
Yes, we have some hope. And with the visit to Riyadh and with the visit to Sana'a and the contacts with the Houthis, my special envoy is optimistic. Today, peace is possible. But it is possible, but there are still many obstacles to be overcome to succeed.
So let's move to another issue. We are commemorating a sad anniversary. We're entering the 8th year of war in Syria. We're here in the Human Rights Room in Geneva. We heard a string of reports, of testimonies, of multiple violations of human rights in Syria. Let's go back to the end of February. The United Nations Security Council voted a resolution for a ceasefire of 30 days in the Western Ghouta and elsewhere. Something terrible happened then. Over 1,600 dead. Today, Western Ghouta has been taken back by force. Isn't this a terrible blemish for the United Nations that this resolution has been voted and then totally discarded?
It's a terrible question for the United Nations and for the credibility of the Security Council. Today, the Security Council is very divided regarding a number of key issues. And even when the Security Council reaches an agreement, it doesn't necessarily mean that this agreement will lead to its practical application. And this is something which is of great concern, especially if you're the Secretary-General and you're responsible for doing your best to get the approval of the resolutions of the Security Council. And it goes beyond the Syrian crisis. To be very frank, we are today returning to a similar climate to the Cold War. We're in a climate which reminds us of the Cold War, but the control mechanisms, the security mechanisms no longer exist.
The United Nations system is then threatened?
The UN system is not threatened insofar as we are working, we're doing our best.
But it doesn't work.
But it must be said, the Security Council is paralyzed, the General Assembly cannot replace the Security Council, and the capacity for action of the Secretary-General and of the Secretary is very limited. Naturally, there are other aspects. The UN are doing a remarkable work, humanitarian work, for example. The UN is responsible for half of the humanitarian work across the world. It's an enormous contribution to world peace. But naturally, we would like to have a Security Council capable of achieving a consensus on a key issue and of applying that consensus, and also for the major powers to have the ability, in spite of their differences, to put in place the mechanisms that will guarantee that the dangerous situation doesn't get out of control.
I'd like to get back briefly into Syria. Your special envoy, Staffan de Mistura, who tries to restart the process or to start it, talked about a risk of disastrous partition. Are you concerned that Syria, which is already devastated, would implode?
There is a risk of the disintegration of Syria. There are different stakeholders in different parts of the country. We must find a political process that will allow Syria to be united, to see its territorial integrity respected, and for the Syrian people to be able to freely choose their future and their leaders.
You're positive on the negotiation perspectives in Yemen, are you? And the same mindset for Syria. Bashar al-Assad seemed to have decided to impose his rule.
I think we are far from having in Syria the prospects for a just political solution capable of uniting liberating the Syrian people. We have to work on this very hard in order to achieve this.
Means things are going bad.
I'm not so optimistic about Syria as I am regarding Libya and Yemen, where the conditions will make it possible in the short term to find a political solution, if the political will allows this.
I'd like to get quickly to another hotbed, which is slightly forgotten today, the Israeli-Palestinian issue. We have witnessed very violent clashes that caused the death of 17 Palestinians. You call for an independent investigation that was refused by Israel, that was blocked by the United States at the UN Security Council. Are you concerned that we would go towards a third intifada? We're very close to the 70th anniversary of the creation of Israel. There are very ripe moments for an explosion of violence.
I'm very concerned about what's happening between Israel and the Palestinians, very concerned. On the one hand, the peace process is paralyzed. On the other hand, we have serious financing problems for financing the UN agency, which provides assistance to Palestinian refugees
Following the American decision
in the occupied territories and in Jordan and in Lebanon and in Syria, with all these difficulties. So I believe there are risks of despair. There are risks that, once again, a new moment of great instability may set in, may develop, and in the context of the broad Middle East, this could have terrible consequences. And indeed, I have issued an appeal. We must restore political dialogue. We must restore a peace process, and we must finance the UN agency, which provides humanitarian support to the Palestinians, so that this despair doesn't set in. These are absolutely key priorities for our action.
António Guterres, thank you for having answered our questions today. Thanks for you for having watched this interview on France 24. Stay tuned for more news.